In this video, we will discuss vSphere with Tanzu Updates. vSphere patches and updates introduce new capabilities and enhancements to vSphere with Tanzu and Tanzu Kubernetes Grid Service. During this lesson, we will describe vSphere with Tanzu licensing, describe supervisor cluster enhancements, identify updates to Tanzu Kubernetes Grid Service, describe the Tanzu Mission Control Agent for supervisor clusters, configure the default container network interface for Tanzu Kubernetes Grid Service, and identify Kubernetes versions for the supervisor cluster and Tanzu Kubernetes Grid Service. vSphere with Tanzu is best run on VMware Cloud Foundation to provide the hybrid infrastructure services of vSphere Pod Service, Network Service, Registry Service, and Storage Service, as well as the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid Service to provision Tanzu Kubernetes clusters. In vSphere 7 Update 1, each ESXi host is licensed with a vSphere Enterprise Plus license, and the ESXi cluster is separately licensed with an add-on Kubernetes license. In version 1.18.2 and newer, the supervisor cluster now supports changing the vCenter server TLS certificate and changing the vCenter server fully qualified domain name, or the FQDN or PNID. With vSphere 7 Update 1, vSphere Lifecycle Manager can manage the desired image state for vSphere with Tanzu supervisor clusters. Tanzu Kubernetes clusters can be upgraded to newer Kubernetes versions. You can upgrade control plane and worker nodes. Supervisor cluster version 1.17.4 or newer is required. The minor version is upgraded incrementally, and upgrading the major version is not supported. For more information on upgrading Tanzu Kubernetes clusters, see the vSphere documentation. Tanzu Kubernetes clusters can now vertically scale worker nodes. This means you can change the VM class, or the CPU and memory sizing, for Tanzu Kubernetes Grid worker VMs. For example, you can resize the worker VMs from the small sizing to the large sizing. New worker nodes of the desired size are deployed, and the old worker nodes are deleted. Supervisor cluster 1.17.4 or newer is required. For more information on virtual machine class types for Tanzu Kubernetes clusters, see the VMware documentation. Tanzu Kubernetes clusters can also scale in worker nodes. This means we can decrease the number of Tanzu Kubernetes Grid worker VMs in a Tanzu Kubernetes cluster. For example, you decrease the number of worker VMs from 3 to 1. Supervisor cluster version 1.18.2 or newer is required. In vSphere 7 Update 1, the supervisor cluster is pre-installed with a special agent that allows it to register the supervisor cluster with Tanzu Mission Control. To register a supervisor cluster with Tanzu Mission Control, first a registration link is generated from Tanzu Mission Control user interface. The registration link is added to a registration manifest specification file. The registration manifest specification file is applied to the svc-tmc namespace on the supervisor cluster. Additional pods will be deployed to the svc-tmc namespace, and the supervisor cluster is registered with Tanzu Mission Control. Supervisor Cluster version 1.18.2 and vSphere 7 Update 1 are required. You obtain the registration link from Tanzu Mission Control and provide it in the registration manifest specification. You also need to specify the svc-tmc full namespace name in your environment. To uninstall the Tanzu Mission Control agents and unregister the supervisor cluster from Tanzu Mission Control, simply change the value of operation from install to uninstall and reapply the manifest specification. Once a supervisor cluster is registered in Tanzu Mission Control, the supervisor cluster details, version, and workloads are visible in Tanzu Mission Control. Tanzu Kubernetes Grid Service supports Antrea as a Container Network Interface, or CNI, in addition to the existing support for Calico. Antrea is a VMware-supported, open-source, Kubernetes native project that implements the Container Network Interface and Kubernetes network policy, providing network connectivity and security for pod workloads. For more information about Antrea, see antrea.io. If a container network interface is not specified during the deployment spec of a Tanzu Kubernetes cluster, the default CNI is applied. You can identify the current default CNI by running the kubectl get tkg service configurations command in the supervisor cluster Kubernetes context. By default, Calico is the out-of-the-box default CNI. You can change the default CNI for a supervisor cluster by running the kubectl edit tkg service configurations tkg-service-configuration command. This command will start a VI style text editor, and you can change the value of default CNI from Calico to Antrea. You can confirm that the default CNI is changed by running the kubectl get tkg service configurations command. If any Tanzu Kubernetes Grid clusters are deployed in a supervisor cluster and they do not specify a CNI in their deployment manifest, these clusters will then default to Antrea. Existing Tanzu Kubernetes Grid clusters already deployed in the environment will not have their CNI changed. You can verify the CNI in use by a Tanzu Kubernetes Grid cluster by using the kubectl get tkc command against the Tanzu Kubernetes cluster's name and outputting the output as YAML. New supervisor cluster Kubernetes versions and embedded hardware versions are delivered in vCenter Server patches and updates. The following versions are released in the vCenter Server versions and patches that have been released to date. Supervisor cluster updates may be released that do not change the Kubernetes version. VMware releases new versions of Tanzu Kubernetes Grid clusters asynchronously to vCenter Server patches. The following Tanzu Kubernetes Grid versions have been released so far. vSphere with Tanzu delivers monthly patches to introduce new features and capabilities, provide updates to Kubernetes and other services, keep up with the upstream Kubernetes releases, and resolve reported issues. The vSphere with Tanzu release notes document what each monthly patch introduces. For more, see the vSphere with Tanzu release notes. At the end of this lesson, we've described the vSphere with Tanzu licensing, described supervisor cluster enhancements, identified updates to the Tanzu Kubernetes Grid service, described the Tanzu Mission Control Agent for supervisor clusters, configured the default container network interface for Tanzu Kubernetes Grid service, and identified Kubernetes versions for the supervisor cluster and Tanzu Kubernetes Grid service. And the key points: in vSphere 7 Update 1, each ESXi host is licensed with a vSphere Enterprise Plus license, and the cluster object is then licensed with an add-on Kubernetes license. vSphere Lifecycle Manager can manage the desired state for vSphere with Tanzu supervisor clusters. Supervisor clusters can be attached to Tanzu Mission Control using a pre-installed agent. Tanzu Kubernetes Grid clusters can be scaled in new ways, and the default CNI for Tanzu Kubernetes Grid clusters can be changed. Thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed this video.